Welcome to Paper Simplified, a podcast brought to you by SILMA AI. So today, we're diving deep into the Phi-4-Mini Technical Report. Our listener sent this in, and it's a pretty fascinating look at how Microsoft researchers are really pushing the boundaries of these compact, multimodal language models.
Yeah, the report is a deep dive. It really gets into how these smaller models can achieve some pretty impressive results.
Right, and for our listeners who maybe aren't as familiar, Phi-4-Mini, it's not just one model, right? It's like a whole family.
Mm-hmm.
You've got the dedicated language model that's, surprisingly good at handling these really complex tasks. And then you've got the multimodal one, which is processing text, vision, and audio all together.
That's right. And in the introduction, they actually really highlight how smaller models are more efficient, and they're building on the success of their previous Phi models to show that you can really get great performance without needing these huge model sizes.
Yeah, that's a big deal in the world of AI, right?
Mm-hmm.
Trying
Yeah.
to keep things compact.
Yeah, absolutely.
And, they're not shying away from comparing Phi-4-Mini to, like, the big players, right? You've got GPT, Claude, and Gemini. But a key thing that they point out about Phi-4 multimodal is that it's open source, which is, huge for the wider research community.
Absolutely. That open source aspect really makes it a powerful tool.
Okay, so let's talk about this mixture of LoRa's, because I keep hearing that phrase.
Okay.
And that seems to be like their secret sauce for making this all work.
Yeah, that's one of the things that really stood out to me as well. It's a key innovation that lets them manage all these different inputs. You've got your text, vision, and audio all efficiently and effectively.
So how do these LoRa's actually work? Is it kind of like having a team of specialists or something?
You can think of it that way. Think of LoRa's as these specialized modules, and they kind of activate depending on the input that the model gets. So if it's text, the language LoRa takes over. If it's an image, the vision LoRa kicks in. And they do all this without impacting the core language model's performance.
They even talk about an experimental version of Phi-4-Mini, and this one's specifically designed for enhanced reasoning. And they say it can actually rival much larger models. That's pretty incredible to squeeze that much reasoning power into a small package.
It really is. Now, moving on to the model architecture itself, which they detail in Section 2 of the report, both the language and multimodal models actually share the same core backbone.
Okay, so it's like one core engine, but then different like extensions or plugins for handling the different modalities.
Exactly.
Are there any architectural details that really stand out to you as particularly clever or unusual in the way they've approached this?
Well, they've gone with the decoder-only transformer architecture, which works really well for text generation tasks. One thing that's really notable is that it has an impressive context length, 128,000 tokens, thanks to a technique called long rope B. And then they also use group query attention, or GQA, and this makes sure that it can generate long sequences efficiently.
So it sounds like they've really optimized it for being able to handle these long streams of information, which I imagine is super important for tasks that involve like complex reasoning and understanding.
Exactly. And they've actually incorporated what they call fractional rope E dimensions, and this just improves the model's ability to kind of smoothly process those long contexts.
Wow.
So that's pretty cool.
Yeah, it sounds like they put a lot of thought into really optimizing the underlying architecture here.
Mm-hmm.
But let's talk about the multimodal architecture, because I imagine this is where the mixture of LoRa's comes into play.
You're absolutely right. The mixture of LoRa's is the key to this whole versatile multimodal model. So they train these separate LoRa's for each modality. And these LoRa's, they're like specialized modules, and they manage the interactions between all these different types of input. And this means they don't need separate models for each task, so it's really efficient.
So instead of having like a whole bunch of different models, you have one model with a bunch of different like expert modules that can kind of jump in when needed.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's get into some specifics for each modality. So starting with vision, how does Phi-4 multimodal process and actually like understand images?
So for vision, they use an image encoder that's based on Siglit 400M, and this is a model that's really good at understanding visual information. And it's fine-tuned using LLM2 CLIP, which aligns those visual representations with their textual descriptions. So this lets the model connect images and words, and that lets it do things like image captioning or visual question answering.
And I noticed they talk about this new dynamic multi-crop strategy.
Yeah.
And this is, I guess, how they handle images that have different sizes and different aspect ratios.
Yeah.
So it seems like they've come up with a pretty clever way to make it more adaptable.
Yeah, and it's more adaptable to previous approaches, which would resize smaller images to a really large size when they were trying to match the aspect ratio. 5-4 multimodal gets around this by dynamically calculating how many crops it needs, and it bases this on the original size of the image and the desired crop size.
Wow, that's a clever solution. Okay, so we've talked about text, we've talked about images, but what about sound? How does 5-4 multimodal make sense of the things that we say?
So, for speech and audio processing, they use 80-dimensional log-mel filter bank features. This is a pretty standard representation in audio processing. And they use a pre-trained audio encoder that utilizes conformer blocks and a projector that's actually quite similar to the one they use for vision. And these work together to extract meaningful features from audio and get them ready for further processing in the model.
It seems like they're kind of drawing on a lot of the established techniques in audio processing, but adapting them for this new kind of multimodal context.
Exactly. They then apply LoRa to enhance the model's performance, specifically in speech and audio tasks. But they do it in a way that makes sure the text capabilities are not impacted. One interesting thing they highlight is that it has an 80 millisecond token rate, and this suggests that it can handle very long audio inputs.
Oh, wow, that's impressive.
Hmm.
So it can handle long conversations or even your podcast like ours, potentially.
Indeed.
Okay.
The ability to process these longer audio sequences really opens up a lot of possibilities for things like speech recognition, summarization, translation.
Right, right. Okay, so I'm curious about the training process because it must be pretty involved to train this kind of multifaceted model.
You're right. The training pipeline is quite intricate and it's a multi-stage process. So for vision, there are 4 distinct stages.
Okay, so they take kind of like a step-by-step approach, gradually building up those capabilities.
Exactly.
So what's the purpose of each of these stages in that vision training pipeline?
Well, the first stage is all about aligning the projector, and this basically means teaching it to connect images with their descriptions.
Okay,
And they do this by training it on a bunch of image caption pairs.
gotcha. So it's like laying the foundation for understanding visual concepts and how those relate to language?
Exactly. And then stage 2, this involves training the projector and vision encoder together on this massive data set. And this just helps the model get a deeper understanding of the visual information. And this includes things like optical character recognition or OCR and dense image understanding.
Okay, so they're really pushing the boundaries of its visual comprehension abilities at this point.
Exactly. Then in stage 3, they bring in the vision LoRa. And this is trained together with the vision components using a data set of single frame data. And this helps the model learn to generate those coherent responses based on image inputs.
So now it's kind of started to put all those pieces together, right? Like
Mhm.
connecting the visual information with the language and figuring out how to generate meaningful output.
Exactly. And then finally, in stage 4, they use multi-frame data to kind of extend the context length for vision tasks. So this enables it to actually understand relationships and connections across multiple images or even video frames.
Right.
So that's really interesting.
Yeah, that's really pushing the boundaries of what we typically think of with, image understanding. It's not just looking at static snapshots anymore. It's starting to understand the flow of visual information over time.
Exactly.
So what about training for speech and audio? Is that a similar kind of multi-stage process?
Yeah, for speech and audio, they have this 2-stage training approach. The first stage involves pre-training the model on a huge amount of automatic speech recognition data, or ASR data. And this teaches it to basically align the audio signals with their corresponding text.
Okay, so it's like teaching it the basics of how speech sounds relate to written words.
Exactly. And once they've done that pre-training, they move on to the second stage, which is all about post-training the model for specific instruction following tasks. So they use curated data to fine-tune the model for things like translation, summarization, and understanding audio.
Okay, so they're starting with those fundamentals of speech recognition,
Yeah.
and then they're building upon that to develop these specialized skills in all these different audio-related tasks.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. And then there's actually a specific vision speech joint training stage, but this happens after all the individual training.
Interesting. So they train them all separately first,
Mm-hmm.
and then they bring them together for that kind of joint training. What's the logic behind that approach?
It just allows each modality to develop its own expertise independently before it needs to learn to work with the others. And it just avoids any potential conflicts or interference that might come up if you tried to train them all together from the very beginning.
Right. let each one kind of find its footing before you try to integrate them all.
Exactly.
So what actually happens during that vision-speech joint training stage?
They freeze the language model, the audio encoder, and the audio projector, and then they focus just on fine-tuning the vision adapter, LoRa, the vision encoder, and the vision projector.
Okay, so they're specifically kind of refining the components that handle the visual and auditory information together.
Exactly.
And what kind of data are they using for this?
They're mainly using vision speech data, which consists of paired visual and auditory inputs, but they also incorporate some language and vision data just to make sure it doesn't forget what it learned before.
Right, got to keep all those skills sharp.
Exactly.
It seems like they've taken a very thoughtful approach to this, kind of step by step, building up the model, getting all the pieces in place.
They really have. And they also have a very specific way of training a reasoning model.
Oh, right, and they claim that this can rival the performance of much larger models. So how do they manage to do that?
Well, they use a 3-stage training process for the reasoning model. So first, they pre-train it on a huge amount of reasoning data. Then they fine-tune it on a smaller, more curated data set. And then they use preference data for something called DPO training. And this helps the model differentiate between good and bad responses.
So it's like they're training it to think critically
Mm.
and to actually make informed judgments based on what it's seeing.
That's a great way of putting it.
So let's talk about this data. I mean, what kind of data did they feed this hungry model to make it so multi-talented?
Well, they cover that in Section 3, and it's quite fascinating.
Okay.
They were very careful about how they chose and curated the data, tailoring it to the specific capabilities that they wanted to create.
So it's not just about throwing a ton of data at the model, right?
Yeah.
It's about picking the right data for the job. So what about the data that was used to pre-train the language model?
Well, for language pre-training, they actually used a massive corpus of 5 trillion tokens,
Wow.
which is a lot bigger and higher quality than they used for the previous model. And they were really careful about filtering out any problematic text using an advanced quality classifier.
So it sounds like they're really focusing on quality over quantity here,
Exactly.
making sure that the data is really good, really relevant, and really representative of the kind of language they wanted to understand.
Exactly. And they also focused on incorporating high-quality math and coding data. They even use a specific instruction-based data set to really improve the performance in those areas. And they actually use synthetic data from their larger Phi-4 model to enhance the training of the smaller model.
So it's like they're using their existing resources and almost like cross-pollinating the knowledge between their different models. Pretty clever.
It is.
Okay, so what about the data used for the multimodal training? So, training the model to understand images alongside the language.
So for vision language training, they used a bunch of different sources, things like interleave image text documents, image text pairs, image grounding data, even synthetic data sets they created from OCR'd PDFs. And to top it off, they even created a specific synthetic data set for chart comprehension.
It sounds like they're really trying to create this really rich tapestry of visual and textual information to train this thing on. They're really showing it the connections between images and text.
And for fine-tuning, they use a combination of public and in-house datasets. This includes a text SFT dataset, which fine-tunes the language capabilities even more.
So they're really drawing on a wide range of resources, both public and their own, to make sure that it's exposed to a diverse range of concepts. Okay, so vision speech training. Now, this is where it gets tricky, because it's one thing to teach a model to understand images and text separately.
Right.
But combining the two together with speech, that seems like a whole other level of complexity.
It is, and they took a really interesting approach with the vision speech training data. They actually generated most of it synthetically.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
How do you create synthetic data for that kind of training? That seems really difficult.
Well, they took some of their existing vision language data, and they used a text-to-speech engine to turn the text queries into audio.
Clever.
And then they just paired that synthetic audio with the original images, and bam, they've got a new data set that's specifically for vision speech training.
That's incredibly resourceful. I mean, they're essentially repurposing their existing data, transforming it to create a whole new training set for this new task.
Exactly.
But did they just use any synthetic data, or was there some quality control involved there?
Oh, yeah, they were very focused on quality. They used an ASR model to transcribe the synthetic speech,
Okay.
and they filtered out any low-quality audio. They wanted to make sure that it was only trained on the best data possible even if it was synthetic.
That makes a lot of sense. They're really paying attention to the integrity of the training data. So what about the data used for training the speech and audio components specifically?
So for that, they used a combination of pre-training data, which had ASR transcriptions, and post-training data that was specific to those tasks.
Hmm.
And they were very careful about privacy. So for the pre-training data, it was about 2 million hours of anonymized in-house speech-text pairs. And it actually covered 8 different languages.
2 million hours. That's a huge amount of data.
It is.
So it sounds like they've really invested in building a really robust data set for speech and audio.
They have. And then for the post-training data, they used a combination of public data sets covering tasks like automatic speech recognition, translation, question answering, summarization, and audio understanding.
So they're really drawing on a lot of different resources there,
Hmm.
both internal and external, to make sure that the model is exposed to a wide range of speech and audio data.
And they even use specific data sets tailored to individual speech-related tasks. For example, for speech recognition training, they use data sets like Common Voice, Fellow URs, and the OpenASR leaderboard, which cover a lot of languages in different domains.
Okay.
So they're really trying to make sure it can transcribe speech in a whole bunch of different contexts.
It sounds like they've really thought through the data requirements for each specific task and picked data sets that are really going to challenge the model and help it develop the skills that they're looking for.
They have, and that really comes through throughout the entire report. Just how carefully they've selected this data. It really highlights how important that is for building a really capable model.
Absolutely, yeah. It all starts with the data.
Mm.
So we've talked about the architecture, we've talked about the data used to train this model, but the real test, of course, is how well does it actually perform in practice? So what kind of evaluations did they do to kind of assess its capabilities across these different modalities?
Well, that's where Section 4 comes in. This is dedicated to evaluating the performance of both the multimodal and the language models. And they did a lot of comparisons. They benchmarked their models against lots of other models, both open source and closed source, to really see where they stacked up against the competition.
So it sounds like they were pretty confident in what they built and wanted to see how it really measured up to what was out there.
Exactly. And the results are pretty impressive.
Well, let's dive into those results. Starting with the multimodal benchmarks, what are some of the key things that they found there?
Okay, so for the vision benchmarks, they tested Phi-4 multimodal on a whole bunch of different tasks. Things like single image understanding, multi-image and video understanding, even vision speech tasks. And they compared it to other models like their previous Phi 3.5 vision, as well as things like Qwen, InternVL, Gemini, Claude, even GPT-4. So they really weren't afraid to go up against some of the best out there.
Wow, they set a high bar for themselves.
Yeah.
So how did it actually do against these other models?
It did really well. It showed huge improvements over their previous model, and it generally outperformed other open source models of a similar size. It even did better than some of the larger closed source models, especially on tasks that involved understanding charts and scientific reasoning.
Yeah.
Pretty impressive for a smaller model.
Yeah, that is impressive.
Mm-hmm.
It's like they found that sweet spot between size and performance. What are the vision speech benchmarks? How did it do in those evaluations?
It also did really well there, outperforming even larger models like Internomni and Gemini 2.0 Flash. And this shows how well the mixture of Lerar's approach works, letting them combine these different modalities without compromising performance.
So it's not just good at one thing, it's good at all these things.
Exactly. And a really important point that they highlight is that unlike a lot of other open source vision language models that need to fine-tune the whole language model, which can sometimes degrade the performance on language tasks, Phi-4 multimodal doesn't do that.
Okay.
It maintains its strong language capabilities, even while it's doing all this vision and audio stuff.
So they're kind of getting the best of both worlds.
Mm-hmm.
They've got this model that can do all these different things, but still retains those core strengths.
Exactly. And now, shifting gears to the speech and audio benchmarks, they really did a comprehensive evaluation of Phi-4 multimodal's capabilities here. They looked at tasks like automatic speech recognition, automatic speech translation, speech question answering, spoken query question answering, speech summarization, and even audio understanding.
Wow, it sounds like they really ran the gamut of
Mhm.
speech and audio tasks.
They did.
So what were some of the highlights from those evaluations?
Well, it achieved some really remarkable results, particularly in automatic speech recognition and automatic speech translation. It actually outperformed some of the expert models, including Whisper v3 and Seamless M4T Large v2. Oh,
Really?
yeah.
So it's beating models that are specifically designed for those tasks.
Mm-hmm. And to top it all off, Phi-4 Multimodal actually got the top position on the Hugging Face OpenASR leaderboard, which just shows that it's really state-of-the-art for speech recognition.
Wow.
And another thing, it's also the first open source model to show speech summarization capability, and it performs comparably to GPT-4 in this area.
That's incredible. Okay, so they're really pushing the boundaries here. Did they go into any detail about, like, the data sets and the methodologies that they used for all of this?
Oh, yeah. They were very thorough in their description. So, for example, for automatic speech recognition, they used the Common Voice, FLIR-Rs, and OpenASR benchmark datasets, which cover a bunch of different languages and domains. They also highlighted that it can actually recognize the language without needing that information in the prompt, which is something that other models need.
Okay, so that suggests a pretty high level of, like, language understanding, right?
Mm-hmm.
To be able to just pick up on those subtle cues in the audio and figure out what language it is.
And for automatic speech translation, they used the Covos T2 and FLIR's benchmarks. And they tested both zero-shot and chain-of-thought decoding.
Okay.
And they found that chain-of-thought decoding, where you give the model extra steps like transcription before translation, actually significantly improved the translation quality.
So sometimes giving it a little bit more structure can actually help.
Exactly. And for spoken query question answering, they did something really interesting.
Okay.
They used the MT-Bench and MMMLU benchmarks, which are usually for text-based question answering, but they actually converted the text queries into audio using their own text-to-speech system.
Oh, that's clever. So they're actually testing it on questions that are asked in spoken language, which is, a much more realistic scenario.
Mm-hmm. And while it did well on this task, it did fall behind some of the bigger closed-source models like Gemini 2.0 Flash and GPT-4, which is understandable given how complex spoken query question answering is.
Yeah, I mean, those are some pretty big models to go up against.
And they actually point out that they focus more on conversational data during training, which might be why their model performs better on MT Bench, which is more geared towards conversational question answering. So it really shows how important it is to tailor the training data to the specific tasks that you want it to excel at.
Yeah, it's not just about throwing data at it. It's about being really strategic about what you feed it.
hmm For speech summarization, they use two datasets, Golden 3, which focuses on real-world meeting scenarios, and AMI, which is a bigger set of meeting recordings. And to make things even more challenging, they used GPT-4 to generate a bunch of different summarization instructions.
Oh.
So it could really test how well the model could handle different styles and content types.
Okay.
So they were really pushing the boundaries of its summarization capabilities. And then finally, for audio understanding, they use the AirBench Chat and MMAU benchmarks. And these evaluate how well it understands all sorts of audio, not just speech, but things like music and sound effects.
Okay, so they're really testing its ability to kind of make sense of the world through sound, not just through language.
Exactly.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, and overall it shows that Phi-4 Multimodal is a really capable and versatile model, especially for its size.
Yeah, it's pretty incredible what they've been able to achieve.
Sure.
But I'm curious, did they go into more specifics about how they evaluated each of these tasks? Like, what did they actually do to test things like automatic speech recognition?
So for automatic speech recognition, or ASR, they used the Common Voice, FLIRs, and OpenASR benchmark datasets. And these cover a whole range of languages and speech domains, so they're not just testing it on, clean studio-recorded speech.
Right.
They're testing it on the kind of messy, unpredictable audio that we encounter in real life.
Exactly. Yeah, real-world scenarios.
Mm-hmm. And one thing they noticed was that, unlike some other models that need to be explicitly told what language they're listening to, Phi-4 Multimodal can figure that out on its own.
Wow, so it's picking up on those subtle cues, figuring out the language without any explicit instructions.
Yeah, it really has a deeper understanding of the nuances of language.
That's impressive. So what about automatic speech translation? How do they evaluate that?
So for automatic speech translation, or AST, they used the Covos T2 and FLIR's benchmarks, and they tested both zero-shot and chain-of-thought decoding.
Right.
And as you may recall, chain-of-thought decoding is where you kind of give the model some extra steps. So in this case, it would involve transcribing the audio first and then translating it. And they found that this significantly improved the translation quality.
Okay, so sometimes giving it a bit more structure can actually help it perform better.
Mm-hmm. And then for spoken query question answering, or SUQA, they took a unique approach. They actually used benchmarks that are normally for text-based question answering, MTBench and MMMLU, but they converted the text queries into audio using their own text-to-speech system, so they were able to test it on spoken questions, which is much more realistic.
Yeah, that's really clever. I like that.
It is. And while the model did well, it did fall behind some of the bigger models like Gemini 2.0 Flash and GPT-4, but that's not really surprising given how complex this task is.
Right.
Spoken query question answering requires not only understanding the language, but also extracting that relevant information from spoken language, which can be tricky.
Yeah, it makes sense that there might be some limitations there compared to those really massive models.
And they actually point out that they focused more on conversational data during training, which might be why their model is better at MTBench, which is geared towards conversational question answering.
It really shows how you need to be thoughtful about the training data.
Mm.
Match it to the tasks. So what about speech summarization?
For speech summarization, they use two datasets, Golden 3, which has real-world meeting scenarios, and AMI, which is a larger collection of meeting recordings. And they actually used GPT-4 to generate a bunch of different summarization instructions for these recordings. So they were testing it on all sorts of different summarization styles and content types.
So they were really pushing the boundaries there, huh?
Mm-hmm.
Making sure it could handle all these different variations.
Exactly. And then finally, for audio understanding, they used the AIR Bench Chat and MMAU benchmarks. And these are designed to assess how well a model understands and responds to a bunch of different audio input. So this includes things like music, sound effects, and environmental noises.
Wow, so this is going beyond just recognizing words, right?
Yeah.
This is about understanding the meaning and the context of all these different sounds.
Exactly.
It's amazing how far we've come with audio processing and AI.
It really is. And it's a testament to all the work these researchers are doing.
Absolutely. So these evaluations show that Phi-4 multimodal is really capable and really versatile, especially for its size. But we've been focusing on the multimodal side of things. What about the specific evaluations that they did for the language capabilities of Phi-4-Mini?
Well, Section 4.2 of the report dives into the performance of Phi-4-Mini on a bunch of different language benchmarks. They compared it to several other language models like Qwen 2.5, Llama 3.2, Mistral, and Gemma 2. So they were really looking at how it stacked up against some of the top performers in the field.
Okay, so they set a high bar there as well.
They did.
So how did it actually perform in these language-specific evaluations?
Well, it consistently did really well, often outperforming models of a similar size. And even doing as well as models twice its size, which is pretty impressive given that it's a smaller model.
That's really impressive.
It is.
So were there any particular areas where it really shined?
Yeah, it showed particular strength in the math and reasoning benchmarks, which was likely due to all that reasoning-rich data it was trained on. They also found that it was really good at instruction following and function calling, which shows how versatile it is.
Okay.
It can handle a bunch of different language tasks.
So it's a well-rounded language model?
Yeah.
But how about coding? Did they evaluate its coding capabilities?
They did, and they actually put a lot of emphasis on coding during training, and it looks like that paid off.
Okay.
It outperformed most other models of a similar size, and even some larger models on a bunch of different coding benchmarks. They were especially happy with how it did on human evol, which is a really tough test of how well a model can generate code to solve specific problems.
So not only is it a language whiz, it's a coding ace as well.
Exactly. And they didn't stop there. They also evaluated a special version of Phi-4-Mini that they enhanced for reasoning tasks.
Oh, that's interesting. So they actually created like a special version that's even better at reasoning. How did they do that? And how well did it actually perform?
They used a three-stage training approach.
Yep.
So first they pre-trained it on a huge amount of reasoning data, then they fine-tuned it on a smaller data set. And then finally, they used preference data for what's called DPO training, and this helps the model learn to figure out which responses are good and which ones are bad.
So they were really pulling out all the stops to kind of boost its reasoning abilities.
They were, and it did incredibly well. They roughly compared this enhanced Phi-4-Mini to several larger reasoning models, including some from DeepSeek and OpenAI, and despite its smaller size, it was able to match or even beat those larger models on several benchmarks. Things like AIM 2024, Math 500, and GPQA Diamond. Pretty amazing stuff.
Yeah, it really is. It sounds like they found some kind of secret formula for packing a lot of reasoning power into a small space.
They really did. And, this has some pretty significant implications for how these models can be used, especially in environments where resources are limited.
Absolutely. But of course, with great power comes great responsibility. How do they actually address the whole issue of safety with these models? Because that's a huge concern.
Yeah, it's a crucial question, and it's clear from the report that they took it very seriously. Section 5 is all about safety, outlining the measures they took and the evaluations they did to assess the model's safety across different modalities.
Okay, that's good to hear. So what was their kind of overall approach to safety?
Well, they followed Microsoft's responsible AI principles, taking a multifaceted approach, focusing on things like safety alignment during post-training, red teaming, automated testing, and evaluations across all sorts of AI harm categories. They really wanted to make sure that these models were developed and used responsibly.
It sounds like they really went above and beyond to make sure these models are safe. So specifically, how did they address text safety?
For text safety, they took a similar approach to what they did with their earlier Phi-3 model. They focused on training it to be helpful and harmless. They used preference datasets, and they worked with an independent red team to find and address potential issues.
Okay, so they brought in an outside perspective to really challenge their own assumptions, which is great.
Exactly. And it wasn't just about training for safety. They also did really thorough evaluations to see how the models would perform in the real world.
So what kind of evaluations did they do for text safety?
They used a combination of techniques, including Microsoft's Azure AI Evaluation SDK and GPT-4, to basically simulate conversations that were designed to try and get the models to generate bad responses. They look at things like violence, sexual content, self-harm, hateful content. They really tried to push the models to see what they would do.
So it's like they're trying to think like someone who's trying to misuse the model and then figuring out how to defend against that.
Exactly, and the results were good. They found that both Phi-4-Mini and Phi-4 multimodal were much more resistant to those kinds of manipulations than the previous models, Phi 3.5 Mini and other similar size models.
That's reassuring. It sounds like they've learned from the past and built in stronger safeguards. But it's not just about preventing the model from generating harmful content. It's also about making sure it can recognize and avoid responding to harmful prompts in the first place. Did they look at that as well?
Yeah, they did. They used the XS test framework to see how well the models could tell the difference between harmful and harmless prompts, even those that are very similar. They found that both models were really good at refusing to answer those harmful prompts, even when they were disguised or phrased in a tricky way.
Yeah, that's so important for any AI model that's going to be interacting with people. It needs to know when a request is inappropriate and just say no.
Absolutely. That's a key part of responsible AI.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about tech safety, but what about audio safety? How do you address that? Because it seems like that would have its own unique challenges.
Yeah, for audio safety, they used a similar strategy to what they did for text. They leveraged their existing text safety data sets and then used text to speech to turn them into audio. But they do admit that this has some limitations. It doesn't cover every nuance of audio data, and it doesn't account for audio-specific jailbreaks, which are still a pretty new area of research.
This is a good starting point, but there's more work to be done.
Definitely. They did do a bunch of different evaluations, though. They used the Azure AI Evaluation SDK to see how the models responded to spoken prompts, looking for any signs of harmful content. They also use Microsoft's Speech Fairness Evaluation, which looks for any bias in the model's speech-to-text performance for different groups of people.
That's important. You want to make sure it's working equally well for everyone, regardless of their background.
Exactly. And then they had this custom evaluation to check whether the models would try to figure out sensitive things about a person based on their voice, which you definitely want to avoid for privacy and to prevent discrimination.
It sounds like they really went the extra mile to make sure these models were safe and unbiased across the board. But what about vision safety? How do they address that?
For vision safety, they stuck with a similar approach. They used the Azure AI Evaluation SDK again. This time, they simulated conversations that included both text and images that were specifically designed to provoke bad responses. Then, they compared 5-4 multimodal's responses to other models, including their previous model and some open source and OpenAI models.
Okay, so they're benchmarking it against other models, seeing how it compares in terms of safety.
Yeah, exactly. They also ran internal and public multimodal RAI benchmarks like RTVLM and VLGuard to really see how the model handles image and text input together, looking for any signs of harm or bias.
So it seems like they were very comprehensive in how they approach safety. But of course, no AI model is perfect, right?
Yeah.
Even with all these measures in place. What do they have to say about the potential weaknesses and limitations of these models?
Well, they're very upfront about the limitations. They acknowledge that because the models are relatively small, they might have trouble with tasks that require memorizing a lot of specific facts. And they might not be as good at handling multiple languages as some of those larger models that are trained on tons of different languages.
That makes sense. There's always a trade-off, right,
Mm-hmm.
between size and capabilities.
Exactly. And they also emphasize that even with all these safety features, the models can still sometimes generate content that's not ideal. They stress that it's really important for developers to implement additional safeguards at the application level, like system prompts and content filters, to further minimize those risks.
Right. It's a reminder that AI safety is an ongoing process.
Hmm.
It's not a one-time fix.
Hmm.
It's something that needs to be addressed throughout the entire development process.
Yeah, I completely agree.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about the architecture, the data, the evaluations, and the really impressive emphasis on safety and responsible AI. It's been a really interesting look at this technical report.
It really has.
So let's take a moment to kind of recap some of the key takeaways, some of the things that really stood out to you about this research.
Well, one of the most significant contributions has got to be that mixture of LoRaS approach. It's such an elegant way to bring in multimodal capabilities without messing up the core language model. It's a really smart and efficient solution.
Yeah, it's pretty game-changing for building these compact, multi-talented models. What else really impressed you?
Their commitment to doing these rigorous evaluations is really commendable. They didn't just want to show that their models were good, they went all out to compare them to other leading models on a wide range of tasks and benchmarks.
And the results really speak for themselves. They've shown that smaller models can still achieve state-of-the-art performance, especially in things like math and reasoning, speech recognition, and translation.
Right, it challenges the idea that bigger is always better.
Their multi-stage training approach is also pretty interesting. They didn't just throw everything at the model all at once, they gradually built up its capabilities.
Hmm.
It shows a deep understanding of how these models actually learn.
Yeah, they took a really thoughtful and systematic approach to training this model to be truly versatile.
And of course, we can't forget about their focus on safety, which is really impressive. They went above and beyond to ensure that these models are safe, unbiased, and used ethically.
Absolutely. They've really set a high standard for responsible AI development.
So this research really opens up a lot of possibilities for the future of these compact, multi-talented language models. Where do you see the most potential for these models going forward?
Well, I think personalized learning and education is a really promising area. Imagine having a compact AI tutor that can adapt to each student's individual learning style, providing custom lessons and feedback across different subjects and modalities. That would be amazing.
Yeah, that's a really exciting vision. It could really democratize access to quality education.
Exactly. And I can also see these models changing the way we interact with technology in our everyday lives. Imagine a smart assistant that understands not just your voice commands, but also what you're looking at, even your emotional state.
Yeah, that's a future where technology becomes more like a partner, adapting to our needs, instead of us having to adapt to it.
Right. And I think that future is closer than we think, thanks to advancements like Phi-4-Mini and Phi-4 multimodal. It's really an exciting time to be working in this field.
This deep dive has given us a great look into that future. It's a future full of potential, but it also comes with some important ethical questions that we need to consider.
I completely agree.
Before we wrap up, I want to highlight another really interesting aspect of this research. They talk about how well the model handles long sequences of information. And this is partly because they're using techniques like long rope and group query attention.
Yeah, that's a big deal. Traditionally, these transformer models struggle with really long sequences of text or data. They can lose track of information or become computationally expensive. But the researchers behind Phi-4-Mini have come up with some clever ways to get around that.
So can you explain a bit more about long rope and how it helps with those long sequences?
Sure. So long rope stands for long range position embeddings. It's a technique for telling the model where each element is in a sequence, even when those sequences are super long. The problem with traditional positional embeddings is that they have trouble representing relationships between elements that are far apart in a sequence. But long rope uses a different way to calculate those embeddings. It can actually represent relationships over long distances.
So it's like giving the model a better map of the
Yeah,
information.
exactly. It's like a better sense of where everything fits within the overall context.
And they're also using group query attention, or GQA.
Right.
How does that contribute to the efficiency?
Well, GQA is basically a modification of the attention mechanism that's used in these transformer models. So with traditional attention, every element looks at every other element, which gets really computationally expensive with long sequences. But with GQA, they divide the sequence into smaller groups, and elements can only attend to other elements within their group. So it reduces the amount of computation that needs to happen.
Okay, so it's like breaking down a big problem into smaller chunks to make it easier to process.
Exactly. And all these techniques together allow Phi-4-Mini to have this impressive context length of 128,000 tokens.
Wow, that's huge. I mean, that's like the length of a short novel. So the model can keep track of information and relationships across a massive amount of text.
Exactly. And that opens up a lot of possibilities for tasks that require understanding and reasoning over long narratives or complex data sets.
It really does. It's like expanding the horizons of what these models can do.
It is. And it's a testament to how fast this field is moving. It's amazing to see these models becoming so capable and versatile.
It's a really exciting time to be following all this.
It really is. And it's important to remember that this is just the beginning. There's a lot more to come.
This deep dive has given us a great glimpse into that future. It's a future filled with potential, but also with some important ethical considerations.
Absolutely.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground in this episode. We've talked about the model's architecture, the data, the evaluations, and their really strong focus on safety and responsible AI. It's been a fascinating journey.
It has.
Before we move on to the final part of this episode, I want to take a moment to acknowledge the incredible work of the Microsoft research team behind this groundbreaking research. Their ingenuity, creativity, and commitment to pushing the boundaries of AI while maintaining a strong focus on ethical considerations is truly inspiring.
I wholeheartedly agree. They've made significant contributions to the field, and their work will undoubtedly have a lasting impact on the future of AI.
So with that said, let's take a short break and then come back to wrap up this deep dive with some final thoughts and insights. Welcome back to Paper Simplified. So before the break, we were talking about all the really impressive things that Microsoft researchers have done with these compact language models, Phi-4-Mini and Phi-4 multimodal.
It's really amazing what they've achieved with these relatively small models. Their approach to data, the model architecture, and their focus on responsible AI, it's all very impressive.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to touch on some of the key takeaways again, things that really stood out. And for me, it has to be their mixture of Loras technique. It's just such an elegant solution for adding multimodal capabilities without affecting the core language model.
Yeah, I agree. That mixture of Loris approach is really something special. It's like having all these different experts working together seamlessly within a SILMA model, handling text, vision, and audio, all without any conflicts.
And the fact that they got such amazing performance on all these different benchmarks, even beating out some of the larger models, it's a big deal.
Right. It really shows that bigger isn't always better.
It's about smart design, efficient architecture, and having the right training data.
Exactly. They've proven that you can get incredible results without relying on just brute force computation.
Their multi-stage training approach is also pretty cool. I didn't just dump all the data on the model at once. They took this really careful, step-by-step approach.
Yeah, that's a sign that they really understand how these models learn.
And of course, we have to mention their commitment to safety and responsible AI, which is so crucial.
Absolutely. It's something that everyone in the AI community should be paying attention to.
This research is a great example of how to push the boundaries of AI while also prioritizing safety and ethical considerations.
Right. It sets a really high bar for everyone.
This research opens up so many possibilities, and I'm really excited about the potential applications in things like personalized education and how we interact with technology.
Me too. Imagine a world with AI tutors that are tailored to each student's needs. Or imagine being able to interact with technology using a mix of voice, gestures, and visuals.
It's like technology becoming an extension of ourselves, understanding us and adapting to how we want to interact.
Exactly. And I think we're getting closer to that reality.
Well, it's definitely an exciting time to be following all of this.
It is. And it's important to remember that we're just scratching the surface. There's so much more to come.
We've covered a lot in this deep dive. We've talked about the model, the data, the evaluations, and of course the importance of safety and responsible AI.
It's been a great discussion.
And to our listeners, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the Phi-4-Mini Technical Report. It's been a fascinating journey. We encourage you to keep exploring these topics, keep asking those tough questions, and until next time, stay curious.